I realize that this subject is going to be difficult to discuss in an open and objective way, but if we, and by we, I mean every single human on this planet, if we are ever going to get a true understanding about what transpired in all of our histories across this planet just in the recent past, we have to be able to openly and honestly look at all aspects of history. There is no way around this, right? I don't care who you are. Anybody that defends the suppression of discussion about real history and by extension real science, that person is ontologically evil. That person is committing treason against humanity, and that will not be tolerated. However, we live in a time to where it is entirely tolerated, and good people say nothing while they are being exploited by others that want to disguise and hide our true history. One of the topics nowadays that is being demonized is this concept of who discovered America. This is actually one hell of a topic because the more you start to learn about real history and the more you pay attention objectively to anybody who has a history relative to North America, you make some unbelievable discoveries. What we find is that essentially almost everybody discovered America and nobody discovered America. Mainstream wants nothing to do with this perspective. And the reason why is, well, there's a few reasons why, but one of the reasons why is because that would change the general historical zeitgeist. That would mean that mainstream historians would have to completely re-evaluate their current timeline that they have so perfectly set up and that is 100% accurate, and that timeline that you are not allowed to question. Of course, it gets even darker nowadays with respect to North America, because right now we have a lot of psychological conditioning programs going on that is literally suppressing any kind of active thought with respect to understanding real history. And this goes for every single person in the West. Does not matter who you are. What this programming is designed to do is quite simple. It's designed to detach you from the truth. It is designed to create a disassociative state within your psychology relative to your understanding of real history. And this is happening to everybody. It does not matter what your culture is. It does not matter what your race is. It is irrelevant. If you are a North American Indian, if you are from a North American Indian tribe, you are suffering from this. If you are European, you are suffering from this. It doesn't matter. It literally does not matter where you're coming from. There is a psychological attack taking place on you right now that is designed to wipe the slate clean with respect to your historical origins. There is no arguing this, right? That is easily scientifically proved. And what's funny nowadays is that you can literally just look around at society and you can see exactly what's going on with that. It's right in front of you. Now, if you're not familiar with that, I'm not surprised. And it's no offense. This stuff is hidden very well. Right? You've grown up with this your entire life if you're in the West. This is all you know. You only know this kind of corrupt programming. You don't know how you don't, okay, all right. I want to focus on the history. Okay, let's get down to this. So, right now, when we go and we ask the question, who discovered America? Who truly has rights to the land? This question has already been pre-decided by the mainstream, and of course the mainstream is run by people at the very top, and these people have built up a tremendous amount of power, and they have no interest in losing that or sharing it with you. Make no mistake, don't ever think for 2 seconds that any of these guys at the very top of the power structure are looking to make you succeed. They're not interested in that. They want to make sure that you stay down so that you do not pose a threat to them. Very basic science, very basic behavioral science, right? That's not a mystery. That's not crazy. And it's happening right now in front of everybody. The only reason, well, okay, all right. Anyway, so generally speaking, when we look at the quote-unquote discovery of North America, right now, Christopher Columbus gets all of that credit. Now, of course, that's a very European perspective. And right now, that's being demonized. And it's funny, it should be demonized, but it's not being demonized for the right reasons. And maybe we'll touch base a little bit on that, although I don't know if I'm quite ready to have this channel destroyed and banned yet, so we'll see how that plays out. But, you know, from a European historical perspective, that makes logical sense, right? If you are from Europe, that's your history. Relatively speaking, yeah, Christopher Columbus may have discovered America, and that's what was taught to people for a long time. And I don't know if it's still, I have no idea what's taught nowadays. Probably nothing is taught nowadays. I think the only thing that is taught nowadays in school is probably, I'll be honest, this is going to be a tough one. All right, I'm going to stay focusing. Anyway, so that's what Europeans basically would have been taught, right? And that's what was taught in North America. Fine, whatever. And it makes sense from that perspective. Now, the next thing that somebody could come back and say from the European perspective is you could say something like, well, I mean, Leif Erikson really did make a journey before that. And that seems to have been proven, and I agree, right? So if you want to be that history smartass, you can make that claim and be accurate, and you can say that that guy discovered America. Okay, fine. Once again, still a European-centric point of view. Once again, nothing wrong with that. If you're from Europe, why would you not have that point of view? You're not going to have a point of view that doesn't exist. That's going to be your point of view. Anyway, so now we already have here, with respect to Europeans, two different supposed discoverers. Okay, interesting. Now, of course, there's another side to this, because when these explorers hop on over to North America, they run into people that already exist here, right? They're already people here. So it kind of makes it weird to say that you discovered something if there's already humans living there. But if we look at it through a particular perspective, it suddenly is no longer a problem. From a European perspective, those guys discovered America. Nothing wrong with that. Now, let's look at the people who are already here, the North American Indians. These guys, they have their own histories as well, don't they? A lot of people seem to forget this, you know, or not, like everybody seems to forget this. A lot of people just treat North American Indian tribes as these cave people that were just wandering around with very little to no history, and they were just a bunch of hippies banging rocks together and shooting arrows at buffalo. I mean, that is literally how mainstream historians treat the North American Indian tribes. Nothing could be further from the truth. These tribes, these people who made up these tribes, they were smart, they were strong, they knew what they were doing, and there was a ton of different kinds of them. That is also always conveniently left out whenever we talk about North American Indian tribes. The Adena were completely different physically, genetically, from, say, someone like the Paiute. This is the kind of stuff that nobody really thinks about. Whenever anybody just thinks of a North American Indian, they just think about some guy with feathers on his head wearing like a loincloth or something, running around tickling buffalo. That's it. I mean, that is the point of view. Nobody really understands that these tribes that existed in North America, even when the Europeans showed up, they were literally genetically different from one another. And there is a whole huge situation within the tribes because of this. I'm not going to cover any of that because that's outside of the scope. But I just wanted to point out that the North American Indians that lived in North America, they were not just this one mass of exactly the same people. There was actually different kinds of genetic lineages living here. Now, this is a problem. Because if we have a bunch of genetically distinct tribes wandering around North America, it begs the question, where the hell did all of these guys come from? And this is a question that essentially is never asked by mainstream historians, and mainstream scientists only have a very little answer for it, and then they move on with life. A mainstream scientist will simply say, well, I mean, these people came from Asia across, the Bering Strait in Alaska or whatever, over that land bridge, and then they all migrated over here and just became the North American Indians. And that's it. Don't ask any more questions. Don't dig into this any further. We've already figured it out. That's it. There's a huge problem with that story right off the bat, because not a single North American Indian tribe's history that goes back far enough talks about anything like that at all. Now, most historians never make it this far. Most historians are perfectly satisfied with all of the North American Indians, magically walking over that land bridge, that supposed land bridge, up there in the north, and they come down through Canada and then end up in North America. And that's it. Shut up. Don't talk about anything else. Don't listen to anything that these tribes say, because they're cave people and they don't matter. I mean, that is the mainstream historical opinion, or not even opinion. That is how they describe North American Indians. The mainstream historian has no interest in listening to any of these tribes' history. Zero. None. They don't want anything to do with it. And the reason why is simple. And that's because their histories have nothing to do with anything that mainstream historians currently believe. In fact, the real histories of all of these tribes is completely different. And in a lot of cases, sometimes they might sound a little crazy to your average person. But on this channel, we listen to the crazy stuff, and we take the crazy stuff seriously. Because what's the point of having a history and recording that history like the North American Indian tribes did, and then completely ignore it? I mean, it's just mind-boggling how historians do that. They want nothing to do with the truth. They only want to say whatever they think is correct, and okay. All right, but, and you know what? For those of you who are really smart and snappy, you probably also just realized another problem. If North American Indian tribes have an origination story, that means they did not originate in North America, which means they are not native to North America. That is a hard truth that the mainstream does not want to admit to, and of course, what the main propaganda stream is never going to admit to, because they have their own agenda. But that's the truth. And that's what that's kind of the focus of this episode, is that nobody discovered America. This is where things will get crazy. Anyway, let's look over some of the histories of the North American Indian tribes, and let's see where they came from. Let's have them tell us where they originated from. And let's get rid of the mainstream, Bering Strait trash thing that's going. Let's just get rid of that. Basically, let's do what mainstream historians refuse to do. Pay attention to North American Indian history. I know, isn't that a crazy concept? Actually listening to the people whose history it is. I know, just mind-boggling, baffling to all of mainstream academics. I swear to God. Okay. But they just don't pay attention. I mean, what am I supposed to do with these people? I mean, there's no reason why they should not be hunted in the street, and you just grab them and start choking them out, I don't know, scalp them. You know what? You could scalp them in honor of them disrespecting Native American history. You could do that too, and then what you could do is you get your hatchet, and then you start going after them, you start hacking. The histories of North American Indians are actually fairly fascinating, not only just because they completely disagree with what all the mainstream science and history says. But their claims are rather, I don't even know how to describe it. Their claims really go along well with real history that we find all over the planet. So, for example, there's two major themes that we find with respect to North American Indian history. The first theme is this. For whatever reason, a lot of the tribes claim that they came from underground. Yeah, it gets kind of weird, but for whatever reason, not everybody, but a lot of tribes have a general history to where their ancestors actually emerged into North America from the underworld, or from under the ground, or from under the earth. Yeah, it gets crazy, but it's funny because we see that in other places on the planet as well. Anyway, here, let me just go over a few of the Indian tribes that talk about this, and, that this has nothing to do with the Bering Strait. Like, absolutely nothing. They are not saying they came over a land bridge. They tell us they came from underneath the earth. So, for example, the Navajo tribe. Their mythology goes a little something like this. They believe that their ancestors essentially emerged from a series of underworlds beneath the earth. Their creation story actually tells of them moving through different worlds before reaching the current one, which they eventually call it the Glittering World. Moving on to the Hopi Indians, they describe their ancestors emerging from a hole in the ground called Sipapu. Not only do these guys emerge from a hole in the ground, but they also have a myth that they travel across the ocean to get to North America. And we'll go into that a little more in just a bit. Then we come to the Zuni tribe. The Zuni tribe also talks about coming from under the ground. They talk about their ancestors traveling from what they call the quote-unquote middle place, or the Earth's center, to the lands that they settled when the Europeans showed up and started recording these histories. So basically, the Zuni tribe also records coming from the center of the earth and then settling in North America. Yeah, isn't that crazy how everybody, for some weird reason in North America, seems to come out of the ground? All right, then if we move on to the Iroquois, their mythology is a little different, whereas they say that their origin involves some kind of a sky woman who fell from the sky world onto a water-covered earth. And once this happened, the earth was created on the back of a giant turtle, which became Turtle Island, which would be known as North America. Right? So far, all of these tribes that we've just gone over, not a single one of them claims to have come over on some kind of magical land bridge. Not a single one. All right, let's keep going. Let's see what else we've got. So, the Cherokee. The Cherokee myths recount a time when their ancestors came from a land across a body of great water. They were guided by the spirits or divine beings to the current homeland, or to North America, I should say. Once again, we have another Indian story to where they say they come across the water. By that they mean they sailed here somehow, right? Probably in ships or something. They were not, walking across water. They were probably in boats of some sort. But once again, no land bridge in sight. No basic bitch migration from some, Eastern Asian land or whatever the hell mainstream currently says. The interesting thing so far is that not a single tribe can lay claim to an indigenous status. Now, if you don't like to hear that, that's fine, I get it, because your programming is going to immediately put up all kinds of psychological barriers to what I'm talking about right now. But remember, all I'm doing right now, I'm just telling you their stories. If you don't like these stories, if you don't like what I'm saying right now, go argue with all of these tribes. Don't come talk to me. I have nothing to do with this. I have absolutely nothing to do with any of this. Go argue with the Hopi. Go argue with the Paiute. You go argue with them. You tell them that they are wrong, okay? I'm just telling you where they came from. They are not indigenous at all. All right, let's keep going. It gets even better. You know what? In fact, before we go further, I just want to point something out. Before I started listing all the tribes and their mythologies and what they say their origin stories are, I said there were two main points. So far, we've already kind of covered two of them, but I want to make sure that the second point is also acknowledged. So the first crazy point is that, a lot of these tribes claim they come out of the earth. they emerge from some kind of a hole. And it's really important to remember they're not talking about a hole or emerging from the earth in the sense of, oh yeah, God molded like an Indian or whatever out of some clay and then, pushed them out there and let them, roam around. It's not like that. They are literally meaning that their tribes lived under the ground in some capacity. Whatever the hell that means, right? That's a whole other ball of wax that I'm not going to get into in this show. Maybe we'll talk about that later. But they literally claim that their tribes lived under, or their people, I'll just say their people, that their people lived in the earth happily, they were good, and then something happened that forced them out from underneath the earth. They literally mean they emerged from holes in the ground physically, not metaphysically, not some sort of weird, like I said, clay molding by a weird god or whatever. No, they come out of like a cave basically because they were running from something. And maybe we'll talk about that later, but that's definitely that's probably a different show. Anyway, the other interesting similarity that many of these tribes will all claim is that they come across the ocean to North America. Even more interesting is one of the reasons why they come across the ocean is because the continent that they lived on sank. I find that to be absolutely amazing. Not only do we have sunken continent stories, in Asia, Europe, Africa, Australia, etc., but over here in the Americas, both North and South, we find the exact same kind of story. This really should have been a red flag for historians everywhere. And every single person that studies mythologies, the second that you heard that all of these people from all over the planet had this story, maybe you should have probably started paying attention. Now, you probably are paying attention, but I'm talking about the mainstream, right? The second we have humans all over this planet talking about the exact same damn event or situation happening, but isn't that fascinating? The North American Indians, some of their tribes are going to claim that they came from a situation like this. Once again, they are not indigenous to North America. Anyway, let's keep going. So, did I already go over the Cherokee? I don't remember. Anyway, the Cherokee, they also come across a great body of water. Then we have the Tlingit of the Pacific Northwest. They have stories of migrations and journeys over vast distances. Some of their mythologies refer to a first people, quote unquote, who came from an island or another region over the sea. You know what? With respect to the Hopi Indians, I think I already covered them because they had a story where they came from under the ground. But they also have another story to where they came from a sunken land called Cascara. And this was described as a continent that was destroyed due to the moral failings of its inhabitants, right? So the survivors from that sunken continent traveled across the sea to North America. Now, what does that mean? I'm not sure because they hold both stories within their tribe. So I'll just take both at face value. Another thing that we have to remember, if we're going to take this stuff seriously, one of the binding roots of all of these stories, by the way, is that there is a catastrophe that kicks off all of these migrations. So, for example, when we look at somebody like the Hopi Indians, and we have them having a story where they come from holes in the ground, and they also say their ancestors came from a sunken continent, it's entirely possible that the mythology that we know right now is actually two other tribes, that actually one tribe came from the sunken continent, and the other tribe, emerged from the ground, and that those two tribes combined, and that both stories were preserved. So what I find fascinating is that if this catastrophe root cause is real, if something really happened to the planet that absolutely, sank continents, caused all these crazy cosmological events, we should actually expect something like this to happen. Because if you had that kind of earth-destroying catastrophe, that means the survivors from all kinds of cultures would have been spread all over hell and back. And of course, as everybody is fleeing from the destruction of their relative area, they would have run into other survivors. And if anybody wanted to survive into the future, all of these people would have had to have come together. And I think that's exactly what we see here. So when we look at some tribe like the Hopi Indians and they have two different kinds of origin stories, this might actually be the reason why. So we could potentially use this evidence to substantiate the reality of the various cataclysms that took place on Earth only a few thousand years ago. Yeah, it gets crazy, right? All right, well, let's keep going. Next up, the Lakota tribe. They also have oral histories that speak of their ancestors arriving from a land across the ocean that was lost to a great flood. Now, it's really important before we go further, whenever anybody mentions a flood, they're not necessarily talking about the deluge. All right, so don't get the deluge confused with another kind of flood that happens later. The kind of flood that the Lakota are probably referencing would have been the flood that took place during the Venus event. And the Venus event takes place thousands of years after the Saturn event. I don't know what you want to call that. When Saturn flared up and we were orbiting around Saturn. Two completely different events, all right? Just keep that in mind. But once again, another tribe saying, hey, we came across the ocean from another land that was sunk into the ocean. We also have the Lenape. This would have been the Delaware people. They also have traditions that includes tales of their ancestors crossing a great water from a faraway land. And a lot of those stories also potentially suggest that that homeland also sank into the ocean. All right, you guys get it. I think I've given you guys enough examples of where everybody came from. The main point here is that nobody is indigenous to North America. Anybody trying to lay any kind of a claim to North America is objectively just stupid. You can't do it because nobody has a claim to it. Nobody is indigenous. I cannot stress that enough. And that's just the scientific truth. There's no way around this. Like I said, you don't have to like what I'm saying here, but everything that I'm telling you is literally directly from the histories of the North American Indian tribes. Facts do not care about your feelings. The only reason why nowadays that this is a hot button at all in Western society in North America is simply because the people at the very top are loving the fact that they are pitting everybody against one another and nobody is paying attention to the people who are truly causing all of our problems. I don't know. I mean, what do you want from me? That is exactly what is happening. It's right in front of our faces. And the vast majority of people in the North America, they don't want to acknowledge this. And that's everybody. I don't care if you're considered a Native American, if you're a European, African at this point, whatever. It doesn't matter who you are. Nobody is looking at the people who are actually causing all of these problems. All right, get off my soapbox. Yeah, I know. Okay. So it gets even crazier, by the way, because when you listen to North American Indian histories, you also discover that when they arrive in North America, there are already inhabitants here. This is always conveniently left out of mainstream history. So let's go over some of their stories about the original inhabitants of North America. Let's start with the Navajo. The Navajo have stories about a tribe called the Anasazi. Now, the Anasazi was an ancient civilization that is generally associated with the builders of the cliff dwellings in the southwest area, kind of around the Mesa Verde and Choco Canyon. Now, the Navajo believe that the Anasazi were spiritually powerful, but vanished due to a breakdown in harmony with the land and the universe. So, according to the Navajo, the Anasazi were the original inhabitants of the area that they would eventually settle. Now, this always gets lost in translation when it comes to your average understanding about North American Indian tribes. And yes, I'm well aware that people think that the Anasazi were taken away by aliens as well, potentially, or whatever. That whole situation gets weird, and that's out of scope for this talk. But isn't it fascinating that even, the Navajo, they say, we were not the first people here. We came here, and the people who were originally here essentially left and allowed us to settle the land, all right? Let's move on to the Hopi. Now, the Hopi migration stories describe how their ancestors encountered other groups already living in the Southwest. One of the main huge examples that the Hopi give is something called the Snake Clan. These guys, the Snake Clan, already lived here, and eventually they would integrate into the Hopi society after the two cultures would meet. Once again, this is exactly the kind of situation we would expect to find if people were running away from a catastrophe that had absolutely destroyed everybody's civilizations. Moving on to the Iroquois, they ran into a people called the Stonish Giants, and they were also in the land before they arrived. Now, these giants were described as cannibalistic and resistant to weapons, posing a huge challenge to the ancestors of the Iroquois before the Iroquois eventually drove them away through lots of fighting and death and war and stuff like that. But what's fascinating right here is this story of giants. The concept of giants in North America is everywhere. And if you actually pay attention to a lot of the North American Indian tribes' history, these guys had to deal with giants by all accounts. It wasn't like some sort of a fantastical fantasy giant type of situation. No, when these groups of people were coming into North America, they literally had to fight their way in against these giants. These giants were not magical happy creatures. They fought back and they killed tons of people. This was a literal war, by the way. This was not some little, 1-2 little skirmishes or something like that. The Iroquois and many other tribes had to deal with the problem of giants. Now, I know that's also a completely different topic, but why the hell are all of these Indian tribes talking about giants and fighting them and having to deal with them, and all of them describing the giants as cannibalistic? Yeah, it gets crazy, but okay, I know, off topic. My point is that the inhabitants of North America were not only other kinds of humans, but there were also apparently giants roaming the land. Next up is a fairly well-known story that has also kind of been just mashed all into one giant North American Indian situation, and that is the story of the Lenape running into the Allegheny. So the Lenape migration story talks about how their ancestors came from the west and encountered the Allegheny people. The Allegheny. I know, I can't pronounce crap. You know what I'm talking about. The Allegheny people. Basically, the Allegheny people, they were already well established living on the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers. The Lenape would eventually ally with the Iroquois to drive these guys out of the area. Once again, we have another history here where you have real war taking place. None of these stories are told in some kind of weird mythological way. They are very grounded. It's just that, the enemies of the Indian tribes that are telling the stories sometimes sound fantastical. So, for example, the Iroquois fighting giants. That immediately to your average person is going to make it sound like that story is insane and never happened. But the way the stories are told, they're very grounded. I mean, these guys are fighting cannibalistic giants, and you have to, they're fighting it with weapons. They're having all kinds of problems, both with logistics and with the actual warfare side of things. It was not an easy fight. I mean, anyway, and then when you go down to the Lenape eventually allying with the Iroquois, these are all very standard, typical things that you would expect to happen if you were engaged in some kind of a conflict. There's no reason to not believe any of this stuff. Anyway, moving on to another tribe called Cree, the Nahanni. Now, Cree legends describe encounters with a mysterious people that they called the Nahanni, who lived in the northern forests and mountains before the Cree arrived. Now, the Nahanni were said to be a reclusive and kind of an advanced people who also disappeared, or maybe just retreated deeper into the wilderness. Now, I always find that fascinating because we also find that a lot of the cultures that predate all of the North American Indian cultures, two things seem to happen to them. Either one, they get integrated into the tribes, and we would expect that. You would think that would be natural, especially, if everybody's kind of the same, anyway. But another thing that happens, and this is not just in North America, by the way, this happens in South America as well, especially with respect to peoples who are considered advanced. The advanced people don't really stick around. There's one or two instances where the advanced people kind of do, but they die off pretty quick. But a lot of them just kind of leave. And if some of them have stories about them leaving, right? Some of these tribes record stories of the people leaving and heading toward the north. Yeah, that gets weird, and that's out of scope for this video as well. But isn't that crazy how like everybody's stories all kind of mix and mash together in one cohesive worldwide tale if cataclysms took place? I know I can't even speak. If a real major catastrophe took place right before all of these tribes show up in North America, this is kind of some of the stuff we would expect to happen. Now, whoever these advanced people were and how advanced they were, I don't know. I don't have good answers for you guys. Or maybe we have some answers, but once again, not in this video. All right, let's go on to another tribe. So the Chinook. The Chinook people, they lived in the Pacific Northwest. They talk about what they call spirit beings who lived along the Columbia River before any of them arrived. Now, what do they mean by spirit beings? I don't know. They just say that there were these spirit beings who would shape the land and imbue it with spiritual energy. But what does that mean? I have no idea. But the Chinooks, they also claim that one of the reasons why they say that they would change the land is because apparently the land was really not all that livable. And these spirit beings, they made the land adaptable for the Chinooks. It kind of makes you wonder if we get rid of the concept of a spirit in the sense of like a ghost, ethereal thing, was it another tribe of advanced people that were chilling there and they helped the survivors of a catastrophe, in this case the Chinook, they helped them take care of the land, showed them what was up, and they took off as well. It gets weird. I don't know why everybody leaves. That's a good question to maybe dig into later. Okay, so let's do this. Last one. The Apache. So the Apache have oral traditions of encountering giants as well when they arrive in the Southwest. Now, these giants were essentially described as remnants of a much older world. And that would be accurate if we are going to pay attention to real history and real chronology that everybody all over the planet talks about. Remember, giants, for a giant to exist, the Earth cannot be the way it is now. The gravity on Earth right now is just too powerful to sustain larger human beings. And don't forget, these giants, these giant humans, we're going to call them giants because they weren't technically human. These guys were ranging between 10 to 15, in some of the crazier cases, upwards of 20 plus feet. But if we just take the average of, let's say, 14 feet, a 14-foot tall humanoid, if you are going to be able to move and shake it like we do today, the gravity would literally have to be different. And so the giants would have existed during a time, pre-Saturnian time period, to where the gravity on Earth was different. And interestingly enough, it's this cataclysm, which would be the Venus event, which sets all this off, which would have changed Earth's gravity, along with its orbit and all of that stuff. We've done shows on that, and we have a lot more to talk about that. Anyway, the North American Indians, the way they tell these stories, it makes sense scientifically. We would expect them to think of giants as an older world kind of people because that is exactly what they were, right? And the reason why we don't see giants today is because they've literally just all died off for the fact that they simply could not exist in our gravity. Now, I know I get that it's still possible for some to be hanging around, and I agree. I don't see why that's not possible, but they would be a far form from what they were back in the day. I mean, they would be described like they're described by people who run into them nowadays. Everybody describes them as, slow, lethargic. sometimes really stupid, etc. That's kind of what we would expect if that particular species was in the process of trying to deal with a heavier gravity, and God knows what else is going on with the genetics. I mean, I have no idea. Okay, anyway, let's get off the giants. The point is that all of these tribes, and there's countless more examples. I'm not going to bore you guys with more of that. We'll do shows on this stuff later, more in depth. What we have going on here is that nobody is indigenous. And in fact, if we really want to get into who really is indigenous, all the indigenous people are now essentially gone. And they were a completely different kind of human. And potentially some of them were giants. Now, here's what's going on right now with respect to mainstream history and mainstream culture as well, and also science. What's being done to all of us right now, and of course Thanksgiving is one of the pinnacles of when they will enact their programs, is that the people at the very top simply want to create a situation to where they are dividing and conquering. So what has happened is they have infected essentially everybody in the Western world with very specific ideologies that do a couple of things. The first thing, and I think I've already mentioned a lot of this, but here, let's boil it down. The first thing that they have done is they have created a dissociative psychological state within society in the Western world. They've done this by filling everybody's heads with so many conflicting lies that your average person, even though your average person is generally intelligent, they have been trained to believe the mainstream authority. So when the mainstream authority says something like giants never existed, or they never say anything about peoples who existed before the North American Indians, what happens is nobody has a foundation to build any real history off of. That means everybody goes looking for a history, and what a surprise! The mainstream already has a preconceived history wrapped up and ready for you to consume. And that is exactly what people are doing. Now, what has also gone on is that we've all been consuming these historical lies our entire lives. It does not matter how old you are right now. You could be 100 years old, you could be 10 years old. If you are currently breathing, you have ingested an ungodly amount of psychological programming designed to ensure that you never have a true grasp on anybody's history. Not only just your own history, but anybody's history. Because don't forget, world history is everybody's history. So it doesn't matter if you belong to a Native American tribe or a South American tribe or some European, civilization or an African civilization or whatever. It doesn't matter. Everybody's histories matter because they all tell the true story. If you can obfuscate everybody's histories and you can disassociate everybody from their true past, what that does is that creates a situation of confusion, which can then be exploited by people who know what they are doing. Even worse, this has been done on purpose, and these people are doing it in such a way that they are gaining power because of it. So, for example, mainstream institutions have created and enforce a very specific chronology that ensures that everybody else on this planet will eventually lose sight of the truth. What happens if you question that mainstream timeline on a scientific level? You are immediately excommunicated from society. Even though the scientific method demands that we constantly question everything, and that includes history, by the way. Yes, history is a science. Do not let anybody tell you otherwise. But if you are not allowed to question history, if you are not allowed to dive into it and actually extrapolate what truly happened, what that means is that for somebody who actually does know what happened, they have a tremendous amount of power over you. So what's going on right now in the mainstream in the West, the general population is fighting each other over all kinds of stupid stuff. For example, right now, one of the hot buttons is Christopher Columbus, quote unquote, discovering America. I hope I've made a good case that scientifically proves that not only did Christopher Columbus not discover America, which of course is being pushed right now, but neither did the Native Americans right now that we call Native Americans. Nobody here is native, and that is a scientific fact. There is no way around this. To make matters even worse, whoever lived here originally, we are literally not allowed to discuss it. How do you like that? You are not allowed to postulate people existing before North American Indians, even though North American Indians are very clear that they were not the first ones here. This should be a huge red flag for every single American that exists. But of course, Americans don't question this anymore because they're too busy looking at Christopher Columbus and blaming him for all kinds of horrible stuff. Let's have some fun with Christopher Columbus really quick. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Right? So Columbus comes over from Spain, lands in the West Indies. For some weird reason, that's claimed to discover America. Yeah, I don't know. Don't ask me. But anyways, that's what spawns off a bunch of Europeans that start to flood over from Europe. Now, right now, this is a hot point of contention because one of the things that is more than likely accurate, by the way, is that Columbus ended up doing a lot of vicious and bad stuff. And by all accounts, he did. Now, I can't say that 100%. I can't prove it completely scientifically, like 100%. But by all accounts, it seems like Columbus was not a good dude. This guy came over. He looks like he did a lot of slavery stuff. He exploited a lot of the locals for their resources, etc., etc. So I agree with anybody who wants to make the claim that Columbus was a bad dude. Yeah, he was. But here is where things get interesting, and this is an age-old trick used by people who are employing psychological conditioning tactics on a population. Christopher Columbus has been dead for hundreds of years. He cannot defend himself. He can now be exploited by the system in any way that the power structure wants. So when Columbus was alive, they exploited him to gain power and control over land and resources, and that worked. Now that he's dead, what the mainstream establishment can now do is they can now reverse it. They can say he's a bad dude. They can now admit to his slavery stuff and all of that exploitation, because what the mainstream power structure can do now with this is they can turn that into their favor. The reality is most North American people grew up with the idea that Columbus was, an explorer that did some very interesting and high-level stuff, right? He found a continent, he sailed across an entire ocean. Those are all tough things to do, essentially. Even though Christopher Columbus actually already had a map of North America and knew exactly where he was going, but that is a completely different show altogether. Anyway, so, you kind of read his exploits, and the way they were propagandized in America was that he was a hero, right? We have a whole day dedicated to this guy. But as the power structure started to notice that people were starting to rally around this kind of a thing in a positive way, they found an opportunity to tear people apart. Remember, the people at the very top cannot allow you to make a team with anyone in your community because you guys might pose a threat to the power structure. So now what they're doing is they're exploiting everybody's stupidity, especially now that the internet has pushed all kinds of garbage. And what they're doing is they're saying, oh no, Christopher Columbus was a horrible dude. He didn't discover America. He was a slaver. He was a bad guy. So what they've now done is they've created a split. They have made one side of people who used to at least think Columbus was some kind of a hero. Now they're demonizing their hero. So those people start to feel defensive. The other side is now starting to say like, oh yeah, Columbus was a really bad dude. And if you like Columbus at all in any way, shape, or form, you're the evil person. So now what we have is we have two different sides in America fighting each other over something that is stupid because both sides aren't paying attention to the truth. And the mainstream people at the very top know this. They know exactly what they're doing. Now, since they've created a schism, we can look down at society and we can see, yeah, people are now at each other's throats for basic stuff, right? Like race, land, power, etc. And that is what the people at the top want. Because while all of us are fighting down here at the lower ranks, the people at the very top are living lives of luxury at our expense. It's time to stop fighting each other. You know what's even funnier now? And I'm very curious to see where this goes. Recent scholarship and science is now starting to prove that Christopher Columbus was Jewish. So I can actually make this statement. A Jewish person came over to America, enslaved the native peoples, the native quote-unquote peoples, and exploited them. What are we supposed to do with that in a world to where it is almost essentially to question the Jewish religion? Yeah, man, it's getting crazy. It's getting weird. It's going to be interesting to see what they do with that. By the way, another note on Columbus. We have to do a whole show on Columbus. Columbus is insane. We you know what? I might do that soon. I don't know. We'll see. But Columbus also seems to have been an illegitimate child of a pope. Yeah, most people don't know that. Dude, his history is crazy. He already had a map of North America, which makes sense because we know that North America was already mapped age of exploration, and I've talked about that. Columbus had that map. He knew where he was going. Even, supposedly the story where Queen Elizabeth is all, when Columbus goes and asks her for, money for the ships, and she responds to him, "Well, sir, it's almost like you've already been there." It's a good chance that he had already been there. That might have actually been true. All right, I kind of lost the thread on this show. Anyway, this is Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Remember to just chill and actually be friends with each other. I don't mean that in a meme way. Don't forget, the people on this planet who are creating all of this divide, they don't care about you. None of them do, at the very top. Stop buying into their garbage. Stop listening to them. And start thinking about how you can fight back. This is your life. As far as I can tell, you only get one. And we right now are living them on our knees just so a bunch of people who are ungodly rich can live a better life. Stop listening to the mainstream historians. Ask questions and do not ever let these people tell you how to think.